I never imagined that being banned from my own son's dinner table would lead me to discover the most devastating betrayal of my 43-year marriage. But when I showed up unannounced to that family gathering, ready to confront my daughter-in-law about her cruelty, I walked straight into a conversation that shattered everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. What I overheard through that kitchen window changed my life forever, and by the time I walked away from that house, I knew I'd never be the same woman who'd arrived there an hour earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Janice King, but everyone calls me Jan, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I had the kind of marriage that other women envied. Harold and I had weathered every storm together for over 4 decades. We'd raised our son Marcus from a colicky baby into a successful architect, survived my breast cancer scare in my 50s, and even managed to stay connected through Harold's midlife crisis when he bought that ridiculous motorcycle and started talking about traveling cross-country. I thought we were solid. I thought we were unbreakable. I was wrong about everything. The trouble started with Stephanie, Marcus's wife of 3 years. From the moment she walked into our lives, she made it clear that she considered me an intrusion rather than a blessing. At first, I tried to chalk it up to normal adjustment issues. After all, it couldn't be easy for a young woman to navigate the complex dynamics of marrying into an established family, especially when that family included a mother-in-law who'd been the primary woman in her son's life for 31 years. I told myself to be patient, to give her space to find her place in our family structure. But patience became increasingly difficult as Stephanie's behavior grew more pointed and deliberate. She'd schedule family events without telling me, then act surprised when Harold and I showed up uninformed. She'd plan elaborate birthday celebrations for Marcus and conveniently forget to include me in the planning, making me feel like an afterthought in my own son's life. When I'd try to contribute ideas or offer help, she'd smile that tight, controlled smile and tell me she had everything handled. Thank you very much. The worst part was watching Marcus navigate between his wife and his mother. I could see the strain in his eyes whenever Stephanie made one of her subtle digs about my involvement in their lives. He'd try to smooth things over with awkward jokes or quick subject changes, but I knew he was caught in an impossible position. Part of me wanted to confront the situation head-on, but a larger part of me was terrified of pushing my son away by forcing him to choose sides. Harold, bless his heart, tried to stay neutral in the beginning. He'd listen to my complaints about Stephanie's behavior with the patient expression he'd perfected over decades of marriage, offering gentle suggestions about giving her more time or trying to see things from her perspective. But even he started to notice the pattern of exclusion, especially after the incident with Marcus's promotion celebration. Marcus had landed a major contract with a downtown development firm, the kind of career breakthrough he'd been working toward since graduating from architecture school. When Stephanie organized a dinner party to celebrate, she invited Harold's brother and his wife, her own parents, and even some of Marcus's college friends I'd never met. But somehow Harold and I were left off the guest list entirely. We only found out about the party when Harold's brother mentioned it during a casual phone call the day before. When I called Marcus to ask about the oversight, he sounded genuinely confused and apologetic. He promised to talk to Stephanie and make sure we were included. But when we arrived at their house the next evening, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Stephanie greeted us at the door with that same brittle smile, explaining that she'd had to rearrange the seating chart and that the table might be a little crowded now. Throughout the entire evening, she managed to make us feel like unwelcome guests crashing someone else's party. That night, lying in bed next to Harold, I finally voiced what I'd been thinking for months. Stephanie didn't just dislike me, she was actively trying to push me out of Marcus's life. Harold was quiet for a long time before he responded, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness I'd never heard before. He told me he'd been thinking the same thing, but he didn't know what we could do about it without causing a rift that might push Marcus away entirely. The situation reached a breaking point 2 weeks ago, when Stephanie called to uninvite me from their monthly family dinner. She didn't even have the courtesy to speak to me directly. Instead, she had Marcus call with some elaborate story about how she wasn't feeling well and needed to keep the gathering small. But when I drove by their house that evening on my way back from the grocery store, I saw cars lining their street and caught glimpses of people laughing on their back patio through the fence slab. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't about Stephanie being overwhelmed or needing space. This was deliberate cruelty, and she was using my son as her weapon. The worst part was knowing that Marcus was going along with it, probably telling himself he was keeping the peace, when really he was allowing his wife to systematically erase his mother from his life. Harold found me crying in the kitchen when he got home from his weekly poker game that night. I told him everything I'd seen, all the emotions I'd been holding back for months, and he pulled me into his arms with the same gentle strength that had carried me through every crisis we'd faced together. But there was something different in the way he held me, something that felt like goodbye, though I was too upset to recognize it at the time. The next morning, Harold suggested we take a weekend trip to the coast, just the two of us. He said we needed to reconnect away from all the family drama, to remember who we were as a couple before we figured out how to handle the situation with Marcus and Stephanie. I thought it was exactly what we needed. We'd always done our best problem solving during long walks on the beach, and I was desperate to feel like we were on the same team again. We spent 2 days in Mendocino, staying at the same bed and breakfast where we'd celebrated our 20th anniversary. Harold was attentive and affectionate, holding my hand as we walked along the bluffs, listening patiently as I worked through my feelings about Stephanie's behavior. He asked thoughtful questions about what I needed from our family relationships, and offered suggestions for ways we might approach Marcus about setting better boundaries with his wife. But there was something underneath his supportiveness that I couldn't quite identify, a distance that felt different from his usual thoughtful consideration of a problem. Several times I caught him staring out at the ocean with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like relief mixed with sadness. When I asked what he was thinking about, he'd smile and change the subject. But I filed those moments away in the back of my mind. The Monday after we returned from our trip, Harold announced that he was going to have a serious conversation with Marcus about Stephanie's treatment of me. He said he'd let the situation go on too long already, and that it was time for our son to understand that marriage didn't mean abandoning his responsibility to his parents. I was grateful for his support, but something about his sudden determination felt off. Harold had always been more inclined to give people the benefit of the doubt, to look for diplomatic solutions rather than confrontations. That conversation apparently didn't go well. Marcus called me later that week, his voice tight with frustration, to tell me that Stephanie felt attacked and misunderstood. She thought Harold had been unfair in his characterization of her behavior, and she needed some space to process the situation before she could be around us again. In the meantime, she was asking that we skip the next few family gatherings until everyone had a chance to cool down. I felt like I'd been slapped. Here was my son, essentially telling me that his wife's comfort mattered more than his mother's feelings, and that I was the one who needed to back down and give her space to recover from being called out on her cruelty. When I tried to explain how hurt I was by the pattern of exclusion, Marcus cut me off with the tired argument that Stephanie was just trying to establish her own family traditions and that I needed to respect their independence as a couple. Harold was furious when I told him about Marcus's. I'd never seen him so angry, especially not about family issues that he usually approached with diplomatic patience. He paced around our living room, muttering about respect and ingratitude, and declared that if Stephanie wanted space, she could have all the space she needed. He said we weren't going to beg for the privilege of being included in our own son's life. The irony is that I agreed with him completely. I was tired of walking on eggshells around Stephanie's sensitivities, tired of feeling like I had to earn my place in my son's life. If she wanted to play power games, she was going to learn that I wasn't going to be her victim. But Harold's anger felt different from mine, more final somehow, like he was closing a door I didn't even know was open. That's when he started talking about the family dinner that Stephanie was hosting this past Sunday. Apparently she'd called Marcus to extend what she described as an olive branch, inviting Harold and me to join them for a special dinner where they wanted to share some important news. Harold's reaction was immediate and decisive. He said we weren't going to show up just because she'd decided to graciously allow us back into the fold, and that if Marcus wanted to repair our relationship, he needed to address his wife's behavior directly rather than pretending everything was fine. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like we were playing right into Stephanie's hands by staying away. She wanted me out of Marcus's life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And by refusing to attend their dinner, I was essentially giving her exactly what she wanted. I told Harold I thought we should go, not to make peace with Stephanie, but to show Marcus that his mother wasn't going to disappear just because his wife found me inconvenient. Harold's response surprised me. Instead of his usual thoughtful consideration of my perspective, he became almost agitated, insisting that attending the dinner would only validate Stephanie's manipulative behavior. He said that sometimes the most powerful response was to refuse to participate in someone else's drama, and that Marcus needed to see the consequences of allowing his wife to treat his parents with disrespect. We argued about it for 3 days. Not the gentle disagreements that had characterized most of our marriage, but real arguments with raised voices and hurt feelings. Harold seemed determined to boycott the dinner, while I became increasingly convinced that showing up was the only way to prevent Stephanie from winning completely. By Friday, we'd reached an impasse, with Harold declaring that he absolutely would not attend, while I remained undecided about whether to go alone. Saturday morning, Harold left early to run errands, saying he needed to pick up some parts for his motorcycle, and that he might stop by his brother's house afterward. I spent the day cleaning and organizing, trying to distract myself from the knot of anxiety in my stomach about the family dinner situation. When Harold returned that evening, he seemed calmer, almost peaceful in a way that felt familiar but somehow different. He pulled me into his arms in the kitchen and apologized for the way he'd been handling the situation with Marcus and Stephanie. He said he'd been thinking about it all day, and he realized that his anger was getting in the way of finding a real solution. Then he surprised me by saying that maybe I was right about the dinner, that showing up might be the best way to demonstrate that we weren't going to be pushed out of Marcus's life without a fight, but he still wouldn't commit to coming with me. He said he thought it might be better if I went alone, that his presence might escalate tensions rather than helping to resolve them. He promised that whatever happened at the dinner, we'd face it together afterward, and that we'd figure out a way to move forward that protected both our relationship with Marcus and our own dignity as a couple. Sunday afternoon, I spent an hour getting ready for the dinner, choosing my outfit carefully and rehearsing what I might say to Stephanie if she tried to make me feel unwelcome. I was nervous but determined, ready to face whatever confrontation might be waiting for me at Marcus's house. Harold kissed me goodbye at the door, holding me a little longer than usual, and told me he was proud of me for not giving up on our family. The drive to Marcus's house felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept practicing conversations in my head, imagining different scenarios for how the evening might unfold. Part of me hoped that Stephanie had genuinely decided to extend an olive branch, that whatever important news they wanted to share might provide an opportunity for all of us to start fresh. But a larger part of me was preparing for battle, ready to stand my ground if she tried to humiliate me again. When I pulled up to their house, I noticed that the driveway was empty except for Marcus's car. No sign of Stephanie's vehicle, which struck me as odd, since she was supposedly hosting this important dinner. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to decide whether to go to the front door or walk around to the back patio where they usually entertain. Something felt off about the whole situation, but I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me. I finally decided to walk around to the back of the house, thinking that if they were setting up outside, I could help with any last-minute preparation. As I made my way along the side yard, I could hear voices coming from the kitchen window, which was open to let in the evening breeze. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the sound of my husband's voice stopped me in my tracks. Harold was inside Marcus's house, talking in the low, serious tone he used for important conversations. My first thought was confusion about why he was there when he'd told me he wasn't coming to the dinner. My second thought was relief that he'd changed his mind and decided to support me after all. But as I moved closer to the window, trying to figure out whether I should go inside or wait for him to explain his presence, I heard words that made my blood run cold. Harold was talking about divorce papers. He was telling Marcus and Stephanie that he'd already consulted with a lawyer, that he'd been planning to announce our separation at tonight's dinner, and that he was grateful for their support during what was going to be a difficult transition. My legs felt like they might give out, and I had to grip the windowsill to keep from collapsing as I listened to my husband of 43 years calmly discussing the end of our marriage with our son and daughter-in-law. The worst part wasn't just that Harold was planning to divorce, it was the way he was talking about it like it was a rational business decision that he'd been considering for months. He mentioned feeling trapped in a marriage that had stopped working years ago, about how the situation with Stephanie had made him realize that he and I had grown into incompatible people who were making each other miserable. Marcus sounded shocked, asking his father why he hadn't tried counseling or given any indication that he was unhappy. But Stephanie's voice was different. She sounded understanding, almost supportive, like this news wasn't completely unexpected. She talked about how difficult it must have been for Harold to live with someone who was so resistant to change, who couldn't accept new family dynamics or respect other people's boundaries. I stood there in the gathering dusk, listening to my daughter-in-law essentially validate my husband's decision to leave me, while my son struggled to understand how his parents' marriage had fallen apart without any warning sign. Harold explained that he'd been talking to Stephanie about the situation for months, that she'd helped him realize that staying in an unhappy marriage wasn't good for anyone involved. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Stephanie's campaign to exclude me from family events hadn't just been about establishing her dominance in Marcus's life. She'd been working to isolate me from my support system while simultaneously positioning herself as Harold's confidant and ally. Every time I'd complained to Harold about her behavior, every time I'd asked for his support in confronting the situation, I'd been giving her ammunition to use against me. Harold was explaining to Marcus that the decision to divorce had nothing to do with our son, that it was purely about two people who had grown apart over the years. But I could hear Stephanie in the background, making sympathetic sounds and occasional comments about how challenging it must be to live with someone who couldn't adapt to changing family circumstances. She was painting me as the inflexible, unreasonable one, the woman who couldn't accept that her son was building his own life with his wife. I wanted to storm into that kitchen and confront all three of them, to demand an explanation for this elaborate betrayal. But something kept me frozen by that window, listening to them plan my emotional destruction with the same casual efficiency they might use to organize a dinner party. Harold mentioned that he'd already started moving some of his things to his brother's house, that he planned to tell me about the divorce after the family dinner when we were alone at home. Marcus was asking practical questions about how they planned to handle the logistics of separation, whether Harold had thought about where he wanted to live permanently, how they were going to tell the extended family. Stephanie offered to help with whatever Harold needed, mentioning that she had friends who'd gone through amicable divorces and could provide recommendations for lawyers or real estate agents. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Here was my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd spent months systematically pushing me out of my family, now volunteering to help my husband dismantle our marriage, and my son who'd supposedly been caught in the middle of a conflict between his mother and wife, was asking his father detailed questions about divorce proceedings without once suggesting that maybe they should try to work things out. I realized that I'd been set up from the beginning. The family dinner was never about sharing important news or extending an olive branch. It was meant to be the stage for Harold's announcement, the moment when he would tell me in front of Marcus and Stephanie that our marriage was over. They'd probably planned it together, figuring that having witnesses would make it harder for me to cause a scene or try to talk him out of it. The most devastating part was understanding that Stephanie's treatment of me had been deliberate from the start. She hadn't been trying to establish her place in the family, she'd been working to destroy mine. Every exclusion, every slight, every moment when she'd made me feel unwelcome, had been part of a larger strategy to convince Harold that I was the problem, that I was the obstacle to family harmony that needed to be removed. I stood there in the darkness, shaking with rage and betrayal, as Harold continued to discuss our divorce like it was already a done deal. He mentioned feeling relieved to finally be honest about his feelings, grateful to Stephanie for helping him recognize that he deserved to be happy in his remaining years. He talked about our marriage like it was a mistake that had lasted far too long, a burden that he was finally ready to set down. Part of me wanted to hear more, to understand exactly how long this betrayal had been in the works and how deep the conspiracy against me went. But a larger part of me knew that I'd already heard enough to understand that my marriage was over, that my relationship with my son was probably irreparable, and that the life I'd built over 4 decades was about to crumble around me. I backed away from the window as quietly as possible, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my car keys. The last thing I heard as I made my way back to the driveway was Stephanie's voice, warm and supportive, telling Harold that he was brave for finally choosing his own happiness over other people's expectations. The irony that she was talking about my husband choosing happiness over his wife's feelings wasn't lost on me. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just learned and figure out what to do next. Going home felt impossible when I knew that Harold would be returning later to carry out his plan to destroy our marriage. Staying felt equally impossible when I couldn't face the thought of confronting them all in that kitchen, of seeing the looks on their faces when they realized I'd discovered their betrayal. Finally, I started the engine and drove away from my son's house, away from the family dinner that was supposed to be the scene of my public humiliation, away from the life that I'd thought was solid but had apparently been crumbling for months without my knowledge. I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that the woman who'd arrived at that house an hour earlier, worried about a conflict with her daughter-in-law, was gone forever. In her place was someone I didn't recognize yet, someone who was going to have to figure out how to rebuild her entire life from scratch. As I drove through the familiar streets of the neighborhood where I'd lived for 20 years, past the houses of friends who'd probably known about Harold's plans before I did, I felt something besides betrayal and rage settling in my chest. It was something that felt almost like relief, the recognition that I was finally seeing the truth about my marriage and my family, no matter how devastating that truth might be. For the first time in months, maybe years, I knew exactly where I stood with the people I'd loved most. And while that knowledge was breaking my heart, it was also setting me free to make decisions based on reality rather than the illusion I'd been living in. The hardest part was going to be figuring out who I was without the roles that had defined me for so long. I'd been Harold's wife for 43 years, Marcus's mother for 31 years, and Stephanie's victim for the past 3 years. Now I was going to have to discover who Janice King was when she wasn't trying to hold together a family that had apparently been planning to exclude her all along. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time, this prospect of starting over at 64 with nothing but the truth to guide me forward. I drove aimlessly through the city for over an hour, my mind reeling from what I'd overheard at Marcus's house. The familiar streets blurred past my windshield as I tried to process the magnitude of Harold's betrayal and Stephanie's calculated manipulation. Every traffic light, every turn felt like a decision I was making in a fog of disbelief and rage. I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, a place Harold and I had stopped at countless times during late-night drives when we were younger and couldn't afford fancy restaurants. The irony of seeking refuge in a place filled with memories of better times wasn't lost on me, but I needed somewhere to sit and think without the risk of running into anyone I knew. The fluorescent lights inside the diner felt harsh and unforgiving, matching the stark reality that was slowly sinking in. I ordered coffee I didn't want and sat in a corner booth staring at my phone and trying to decide who I could call or where I could go. That wouldn't involve explaining why my entire life had just imploded. The waitress, a woman about my age with kind eyes and tired feet, kept refilling my cup without asking. After my third refill, she finally sat down across from me during a lull in customers and asked if I was all right. Something about her gentle concern broke through the numbness I'd been wrapped in since leaving Marcus's house, and I found myself telling a complete stranger that I'd just discovered my husband was divorcing me and that my own family had been plotting against me for months. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of sympathy, and when I finished talking, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me that she'd been through her own divorce 15 years earlier, that the betrayal was always the hardest part to get over, harder even than the loneliness that came after. But she also said something that stuck with me through everything that followed. She said that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the thing that saves you from wasting any more years on people who don't deserve you. I stayed at that diner until nearly midnight, using the time to make a mental inventory of everything I knew, and everything I needed to find out. Harold had mentioned that he'd already started moving his things to his brother's house, which meant this divorce plan had been in motion for weeks, possibly months. He'd also said that he'd consulted with a lawyer, which meant there were legal proceedings I knew nothing about. Most disturbing of all, Stephanie had been involved in his decision-making process, offering support and encouragement for him to leave his wife of 4 decades. When I finally drove home, the house felt different, like I was seeing it through new eyes. I walked through the rooms Harold and I had decorated together, noticing for the first time how many of his personal items were missing. His favorite reading chair looked oddly empty without the stack of magazines he usually kept beside it. The bathroom counter was missing his electric razor and the cologne I'd bought him for Christmas. Even his side of our walk-in closet seemed sparse, though he'd been careful to leave enough clothing behind that I wouldn't notice the gaps unless I was specifically looking for them. The evidence of his deception was everywhere once I knew what to look for. The motorcycle parts he'd claimed to be shopping for yesterday were nowhere to be found, but I did discover that several important documents were missing from our home office, including our tax returns from the past 3 years, and the folder containing information about our joint bank account. Harold had been systematically preparing to leave me while pretending to support me through the conflict with Stephanie. I spent most of that night sitting in our kitchen, drinking tea and trying to reconstruct the timeline of Harold's betrayal. When had he first started talking to Stephanie about our marriage? When had he decided that divorce was preferable to working through our problems together? How long had Marcus known about his father's plans? And why hadn't my own son thought to warn me that my marriage was ending? The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over 2 years. I couldn't imagine sitting through meetings and pretending everything was normal when my entire world had shifted overnight. Instead, I drove to Harold's brother's house, determined to confront my husband before he had a chance to stage his carefully planned announcement. If he wanted a divorce, he was going to have to look me in the eye and tell me himself, not ambush me in front of our son and his manipulative wife. Tom answered the door with a guilty expression that confirmed Harold was indeed staying there. When I asked to speak with my husband, Tom's face crumpled with sympathy and he invited me inside without asking questions. Harold was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. When he looked up and saw me, the color drained from his face, and I knew he realized that his secret was out. We stared at each other across Tom's kitchen for several long seconds before Harold finally spoke. His voice was quiet and careful, like he was trying to defuse a bomb that might explode at any moment. He asked me how I'd found out about his plans, and when I told him about overhearing the conversation at Marcus's house, he closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead with the weary gesture of a man who'd been caught in a lie he no longer had the energy to maintain. What followed was the most honest conversation Harold and I had shared in years, though honesty came too late to save anything between us. He admitted that he'd been unhappy in our marriage for longer than he cared to admit, that watching me struggle with Stephanie had made him realize how different we'd become as people. He said that Stephanie had helped him understand that it wasn't fair to either of us to stay in a relationship that had stopped working, that we both deserved a chance to find happiness in whatever years we had left. I asked him when he'd first started confiding in Stephanie about our marriage, and his answer made me feel sick. He'd been talking to her about his dissatisfaction with our relationship since shortly after she and Marcus got engaged. What I'd interpreted as normal wedding stress and adjustment issues had actually been Stephanie systematically undermining my marriage while positioning herself as Harold's emotional confidant and advisor. The scope of her manipulation was breathtaking. She'd been playing a long game, using Harold's frustrations with our marriage to drive a wedge between us while simultaneously making herself indispensable to both the men in my family. Every time I'd complained to Harold about her behavior, she'd been there to offer him sympathy for having to deal with a difficult wife. Every time I'd tried to assert my place in Marcus's life, she'd been whispering in Harold's ear about how controlling and inflexible I was becoming. Harold tried to convince me that his decision to pursue divorce was entirely his own, that Stephanie had simply helped him recognize feelings he'd been suppressing for years. But I could see the truth in his guilty expression and hear it in his defensive tone. My daughter-in-law had orchestrated the destruction of my marriage with the patience and precision of a master strategist, and my husband had been too weak or too willing to resist her influence. The worst part of our conversation wasn't Harold's admission that he wanted to end our marriage. It was his complete inability to understand why I felt betrayed by the way he'd gone about it. He seemed genuinely puzzled by my anger about his secretive planning and his alliance with Stephanie. In his mind, he'd been trying to handle a difficult situation as gently as possible, sparing me unnecessary conflict by making all the arrangements before telling me about his decision. When I pointed out that he'd been lying to me for months while pretending to support me through the situation with Stephanie, he became defensive and accused me of being dramatic. He said that he'd never lied to me directly, that he'd simply been trying to figure out the best way to approach an admittedly complicated situation. The fact that he could split those particular hairs with a straight face while sitting in his brother's kitchen after secretly moving out of our house showed me just how far apart we'd grown. I left Tom's house that morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Harold's betrayal was devastating, but it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions about Stephanie's behavior, wondering if I was being too sensitive or unreasonable in my reactions to her treatment of me. Now I knew that my instincts had been correct all along. She had been deliberately working to undermine my relationships with both my husband and my son, and she'd succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls with lawyers, accountants, and real estate agents. Harold might have gotten a head start on the practical aspects of our divorce, but I wasn't going to let him control the entire process. I hired my own attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in complex divorces involving significant assets and family businesses. When I told her about Harold's secret preparations and his financial maneuvering, her expression hardened with professional indignation. Rebecca explained that Harold's behavior might actually work in my favor during settlement negotiations. His secretive transfer of documents and assets could be construed as an attempt to hide marital property, which could result in a larger settlement for me. She also pointed out that his long-term emotional affair with our daughter-in-law, even if it hadn't been physical, demonstrated a pattern of deception that would influence how the court viewed his character and credibility. While Rebecca handled the legal aspects of my situation, I began the more personal work of figuring out who I was going to be after my marriage ended. I'd been Harold's wife for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to make decisions based solely on my own preferences and priorities. The prospect of rebuilding my life at 64 was terrifying, but it was also oddly exciting in a way I hadn't anticipated. I started by reclaiming spaces in our house that had been unconsciously shaped by Harold's preferences over the years. I moved furniture around in the living room, hung artwork he'd never liked, and finally painted the guest bedroom the soft lavender color I'd always wanted. Each small change felt like an act of rebellion against the woman I'd been, the woman who'd spent decades deferring to her husband's opinions and trying to keep peace in a family that had been working against her. The hardest part wasn't the practical aspects of divorce or even the emotional pain of Harold's betrayal. It was the gradual realization of how isolated I'd become over the years without realizing it. Most of our social circle consisted of other couples who'd known Harold and me as a unit for decades. When word of our separation began to spread, I discovered that many of these friendships had been more about social convenience than genuine affection or loyalty. Some people stopped calling altogether, clearly uncomfortable with the messiness of divorce and uncertain about how to maintain relationships with both parties. Others made awkward attempts to stay neutral, inviting me to group events where they carefully avoided mentioning Harold while obviously editing their conversation to avoid topics that might be painful. A few well-meaning friends tried to play mediator, suggesting that Harold and I should try counseling or that we were making a mistake by giving up on a marriage that had lasted so long. The most painful responses came from people who seemed to side with Harold without saying so direct. They'd make comments about how difficult divorce must be at our age, or how they hoped we could work things out for Marcus's sake, or how they'd always admired how patient Harold was in difficult situations. The implication was clear: they saw me as the problem in our marriage, the difficult wife who'd driven away a good man through her own unreasonable behavior. I began to understand that Stephanie's campaign against me had been more successful than I'd realized. She hadn't just manipulated Harold and Marcus, she'd been subtly influencing the broader narrative about our family dynamics for years. When people in our social circle thought about the tension in Marcus's family, they saw an overbearing mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's independence and a patient daughter-in-law who was trying to establish healthy boundaries. They didn't see the calculated manipulation and systematic exclusion that had actually been taking place. The realization that I'd been fighting a battle where the terms of engagement had been predetermined by my opponent was both devastating and enlightening. I'd been trying to defend myself against accusations I didn't even know were being made, trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I was the villain in my own family's story. No wonder I'd felt like I was losing my mind during those months of escalating conflict with Stefan. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Tom's house, Harold finally returned to our home to collect more of his belongings and to have what he called a final conversation about our future. He seemed surprised by the changes I'd made to the house, commenting on the rearranged furniture and fresh paint with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been regret. For a moment I thought he might be reconsidering his decision to end our marriage, but any hope of reconciliation evaporated when he started talking about the practical aspects of our separation. He'd already found an apartment across town and had made arrangements to have his remaining belongings moved out over the weekend. He handed me a folder containing financial documents and a proposed settlement agreement that his lawyer had prepared, explaining that he hoped we could handle our divorce amicably without involving the courts more than necessary. As I looked through the papers, I realized that Harold's idea of an amicable settlement was heavily weighted in his favor. He was proposing to keep his pension and retirement accounts while offering me a token amount of cash and the right to stay in our house until it sold. When I pointed out that I'd contributed to his retirement savings throughout our marriage and that I'd sacrificed career opportunities to support his advancement, he looked genuinely surprised, as if he'd never considered that I might have my own financial needs after our divorce. The conversation deteriorated quickly from there. Harold seemed to expect that I would gratefully accept whatever arrangement he'd decided was fair, and he became defensive when I questioned the terms of his proposal. He accused me of being greedy and vindictive, suggesting that I was trying to punish him financially for his decision to pursue happiness. The man I'd been married to for 43 years honestly seemed to believe that I should facilitate my own impoverishment to make his transition to single life more comfortable. When I told him that I'd hired my own lawyer and that we'd be negotiating any settlement through our attorneys, Harold's facade of reasonableness finally cracked. He raised his voice for the first time in our conversation, accusing me of being deliberately difficult and making threats about taking our dispute to court if I didn't accept his generous offer. The transformation from the patient, diplomatic man I'd married to this angry stranger demanding compliance was shocking, but it also completed the process of killing whatever residual love I might have felt for him. Our final argument took place in the same kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations over the decades. Harold stood by the window where I'd once watched him play with Marcus in the backyard, his face red with frustration as he told me that he'd tried to handle our separation with dignity but that I was determined to make everything as painful as possible. I stood by the counter where I'd prepared countless birthday cakes and holiday meals for our family, feeling nothing but contempt for the man who thought he could discard me like an outdated appliance and expect my cooperation in the process. When Harold finally left that evening, taking another suitcase of his belongings with him, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the night I'd discovered his betrayal. I felt powerful. Not happy or relieved, or even satisfied, but genuinely powerful in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or permission. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was operating from a position of clarity about what I wanted and what I was willing to accept. The woman who'd been so devastated by Stephanie's exclusion from family dinners was gone, replaced by someone who understood that being excluded from a toxic system wasn't a punishment but a gift. The wife who'd spent months begging for Harold's support and validation had been replaced by someone who recognized that his support had never been worth having. Most importantly, the mother who'd been desperate to maintain her relationship with Marcus at any cost was beginning to understand that some relationships aren't worth preserving if they require you to betray yourself. I spent the following week putting together a comprehensive response to Harold's settlement proposal with Rebecca's help. We documented every asset he'd failed to disclose, every financial contribution I'd made to our marriage, and every instance of his deceptive behavior leading up to our separation. When we were finished, Harold's generous offer looked like exactly what it was, an attempt to cheat his wife out of her fair share of the wealth they'd built together over 4 decades. But even more important than the financial calculations was the emotional accounting I was doing in my own mind. I was tallying up not just the monetary value of my contributions to our marriage, but the psychological cost of being married to a man who could be so easily manipulated by our daughter-in-law's agenda. I was calculating not just what I was owed in terms of property and support, but what I was worth as a human being who deserved better than the treatment I'd received from my own family. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Harold's betrayal was actually the best thing that could have happened to me. Without it, I might have spent the rest of my life trying to navigate the impossible dynamics Stephanie had created, gradually losing pieces of myself in a futile attempt to maintain relationships with people who'd already decided I was disposable. His decision to leave had freed me from a marriage that had become a prison and a family system that had become a weapon aimed at my own heart. I was still hurt, still angry, still grieving the life I'd thought I had. But underneath all of those painful emotions was something new and unexpected: excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in decades, I was going to get to discover who Janice King really was when she wasn't defined by her relationships to other people. I was going to get to make choices based on what I wanted, rather than what everyone else expected from me. And I was going to get to build a life that reflected my own values, rather than compromising them to keep other people comfortable. The thought of starting over at 64 should have been terrifying, and in some ways it was, but it was also exhilarating in a way I hadn't felt since I was young and the whole world seemed full of potential. Harold and Stephanie had tried to write me out of the story of my own life, but all they'd really done was give me the opportunity to start a new chapter where I was the author instead of just a supporting character in someone else's narrative. As I sat in my newly rearranged living room, surrounded by the artwork Harold had never liked and the colors he'd never approved of, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt like myself again, not Harold's wife or Marcus's mother or Stephanie's victim, but simply Janice King, a woman with her own thoughts and feelings and dreams, and the freedom to pursue them without asking anyone's permission. It was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done, rebuilding my life from scratch at this stage, but it was also going to be the most honest thing I'd ever done. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like enough. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reorganizing my closet, donating clothes that belonged to the woman I used to be. Rebecca's voice was tight with controlled anger when she told me what her investigation had uncovered about Harold's financial activities. It wasn't just that he'd been moving money around in preparation for our divorce. He'd been systematically draining our joint accounts for over 8 months, transferring funds to accounts I'd never heard of, and making investments in his name only. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined. Harold hadn't just decided to leave me, he'd been stealing from me while pretending to love me. Rebecca's forensic accountant had traced over $60,000 in unauthorized transfers, money that had been moved in small amounts over time to avoid triggering any automatic notifications from our bank. The man I'd trusted with my financial security had been methodically impoverishing me while planning his escape. But that wasn't the worst discovery. Rebecca had also found evidence that Harold had taken out a second mortgage on our house 6 months earlier, using the equity we'd built together over 20 years to fund what appeared to be lifestyle expenses and legal fees. He'd forged my signature on the loan documents, a federal crime that could send him to prison if I chose to pursue criminal charges. The house I'd thought was our security blanket for retirement was now mortgaged to the hilt, and I hadn't known anything about it. I sat in Rebecca's office, staring at bank statements and loan documents that painted a picture of financial deception so extensive it felt like I was learning about a stranger's life. Harold hadn't just been unfaithful emotionally, he'd been robbing me blind while I worried about family dinners and birthday party invitations. Every dollar he'd stolen represented trust I'd given freely, faith I'd invested in a partnership that had apparently been a sham for longer than I wanted to calculate. The timeline was devastating. Harold's financial betrayal had begun around the same time. Stephanie started escalating her campaign to exclude me from family events. While I'd been focused on navigating the emotional minefield of family dynamics, my husband had been quietly dismantling our shared financial foundation. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental. Stephanie's psychological warfare had provided the perfect distraction while Harold executed his plan to leave me with nothing. Rebecca explained that Harold's behavior constituted what the law called economic abuse, a form of domestic violence that involved controlling someone through financial manipulation. She'd seen cases like mine before, usually involving men who'd grown tired of their wives, but wanted to avoid paying fair settlements. They'd spend months or even years moving assets and creating debt in their spouse's name, then file for divorce from a position of manufactured financial advantage. The forged signature on the mortgage documents was particularly damning because it demonstrated clear intent to defraud. Rebecca believed we could use it as leverage to negotiate a settlement that would not only recover the stolen money, but also compensate me for the emotional distress of discovering that my husband was essentially a white-collar criminal. If Harold wanted to avoid criminal prosecution, he was going to have to make me whole financially and then some. But even as Rebecca outlined our legal strategy, I found myself thinking about the psychological implications of what Harold had done. This wasn't just about money, though the financial betrayal was devastating enough. This was about the complete dissolution of trust between two people who'd supposedly built their lives around their commitment to each other. Harold hadn't just decided to leave me, he'd decided to destroy me systematically while pretending to be my loving partner. I left Rebecca's office that afternoon with a new understanding of the scope of Harold's deception, and a burning need to understand how long Stephanie had been involved in his planning. The timing of her behavior and his financial crimes was too coordinated to be accidental. I was beginning to suspect that my daughter-in-law hadn't just encouraged Harold to leave me, she'd helped him develop a strategy for doing it in the most financially advantageous way possible. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Harold's brother Tom and asked if I could come over to talk. Tom had always been more forthright than Harold, less inclined to sugarcoat uncomfortable truths or avoid difficult conversation. If anyone would be willing to tell me what they knew about Harold's planning and Stephanie's involvement, it would be him. Tom's wife Ellen answered the door with a guilty expression that immediately told me she knew more than she'd previously admitted. When I explained that I needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening in my marriage, Ellen glanced toward the living room where Tom was watching television, and made a decision that would change everything I thought I knew about my family's betrayal. She invited me into the kitchen and closed the door, then told me that Harold had been confiding in them about his plans to leave me for over a year. But it wasn't just Harold who'd been sharing information. Stephanie had been calling Ellen regularly, ostensibly to ask for advice about family dynamics, but actually to gather intelligence about my relationship with Harold's side of the family. She'd been working to isolate me from my support network while simultaneously building alliances with people I'd considered my friends and advocates. Ellen's revelations painted a picture of conspiracy that went far beyond what I'd imagined. Stephanie hadn't just manipulated Harold. She'd been working to turn Harold's entire family against me. She'd shared carefully edited versions of our conflicts, portraying me as an unstable woman who was making unreasonable demands on her son, and being unfairly critical of his wife. Over time, she'd convinced Tom and Ellen that I was the source of all the tension in Marcus's marriage, and that Harold was suffering in silence to protect his son from having to choose sides. The manipulation had been so gradual and subtle that even Ellen hadn't realized what was happening until she started comparing notes with other family members. Stephanie had told slightly different versions of the same stories to different people, always casting herself as the reasonable party trying to accommodate a difficult mother-in-law. She'd been particularly effective at exploiting existing family dynamics, playing on Tom's protective instincts toward his younger brother and Ellen's desire to maintain family harmony. But Ellen's most shocking revelation was about the timeline of Harold's decision to pursue divorce. According to her, Harold had been talking about leaving me since before Marcus and Stephanie's wedding 3 years earlier. Stephanie had apparently convinced him during the engagement period that he deserved better than a wife who couldn't accept change gracefully, and she'd been encouraging him to consider divorce as a viable option long before I'd even realized there were serious problems in our marriage. The wedding itself had been a kind of test, Ellen explained. Stephanie had deliberately created situations during the planning process that would highlight what she saw as my rigid and controlling personality. When I'd objected to some of her more unconventional ideas or tried to offer suggestions based on my experience with formal events, Stephanie had framed my input as interference and manipulation. Harold had watched these conflicts unfold and seen confirmation of everything Stephanie had been telling him about my character. Ellen apologized cheerfully for not telling me sooner about Harold's plans, explaining that she'd hoped he would come to his senses and recognize what he was throwing away. She'd also been afraid that warning me might make the situation worse by forcing a confrontation before Harold was ready to be honest about his feelings. She'd convinced herself that staying neutral was the kindest approach for everyone involved, but now she realized that her silence had enabled Harold and Stephanie to continue their deception unchecked. As I listened to Ellen's account of the past 3 years, I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Every family gathering where I'd felt excluded or uncomfortable had been deliberately orchestrated to demonstrate my inability to adapt to changing family dynamics. Every argument Harold and I'd had about Stephanie's behavior had been reported back to her and used as evidence of my unreasonable expectations and controlling nature. I'd been living inside a psychological experiment designed to prove that I was unworthy of my husband's love and my son's loyalty. The most devastating revelation was that Marcus had been aware of his father's intentions for months before the planned announcement. Stephanie had convinced him that Harold's unhappiness was primarily my fault and that the kindest thing for everyone would be to allow Harold to leave the marriage without a prolonged battle. Marcus had been coached to see his father as a victim of his mother's inability to accept the natural evolution of family relationships. Ellen also told me something that made my blood run cold. Stephanie had been researching divorce law and financial planning for months, supposedly to help a friend who was going through a difficult separation. But now Ellen suspected that this research had been intended to help Harold structure his departure in the most financially advantageous way possible. Stephanie's background in business administration had given her the knowledge needed to advise Harold on asset protection and debt-shifting strategy. The second mortgage on our house hadn't been Harold's idea. It had been Stephanie's suggestion, presented as a way to free up cash for home improvements that would increase the property's value before sale. She'd even recommended the loan officer, a friend of hers who specialized in expedited approvals and minimal documentation requirements. Harold had been coached through every step of the process, including the signature forgery that had made the loan possible without my knowledge. I left Tom and Ellen's house that night with a comprehensive understanding of the conspiracy that had destroyed my marriage and alienated me from my son. But I also left with something more valuable: the names of witnesses who could testify to the premeditation and scope of Harold and Stephanie's deception. Ellen had offered to provide a sworn statement about everything Stephanie had told her, and Tom was willing to testify about Harold's long-term planning and financial maneuvering. The next morning, I called Rebecca with the new information Ellen had provided. Her reaction was immediate and decisive. With evidence of conspiracy and premeditation, we could pursue not just divorce proceedings, but also criminal charges for fraud and identity theft. More importantly, we could seek punitive damages that would go far beyond simply recovering the money Harold had stolen. We could make him pay for the calculated cruelty of his betrayal. But Rebecca also warned me that pursuing criminal charges would make our divorce proceedings more contentious and public. Harold would likely respond by trying to discredit my testimony and portraying me as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge rather than just. Stephanie would probably be called as a witness, and she'd undoubtedly present herself as an innocent bystander who'd simply tried to help her father-in-law through a difficult period in his marriage. The decision about how aggressively to pursue Harold and Stephanie legally was mine to make, but Rebecca strongly encouraged me to consider the full scope of what they'd done. This wasn't just a case of a husband leaving his wife for someone else. This was a calculated campaign of psychological and financial abuse that had been planned and executed over years. The level of deception and manipulation involved suggested that Harold and Stephanie were capable of continued harassment and retaliation if they weren't held fully accountable for their actions. I spent the next week gathering additional evidence and documentation of the conspiracy against me. I went through old emails and text messages, looking for patterns in Harold's behavior that I'd missed at the time. I reviewed our financial records more carefully, identifying other suspicious transactions and unexplained expenses. Most importantly, I reached out to other family members and friends to see what information Stephanie had shared with them about our family conflicts. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than what Ellen had revealed. Stephanie had been conducting what amounted to a public relations campaign against me for years, sharing carefully crafted narratives about my behavior with anyone who would listen. She'd portrayed herself as a patient daughter-in-law trying to accommodate a difficult mother-in-law, while simultaneously gathering ammunition to use against me in future conflict. Several people told me about conversations with Stephanie where she'd expressed concern about my mental health and emotional stability. She'd suggested that I was having difficulty accepting the natural changes that come with aging and that my resistance to Marcus's marriage was symptomatic of deeper psychological issues. She'd even implied that Harold was staying in our marriage primarily out of concern for my well-being, sacrificing his own happiness to protect me from the trauma of abandonment. The most chilling discovery came from my neighbor across the street, an elderly woman named Miss Chin who'd been friendly with me for over 15 years. She told me that Stephanie had approached her several months earlier, ostensibly to ask for advice about managing family conflict. During their conversation, Stephanie had suggested that I'd been behaving erratically and that the family was concerned about my ability to live independently. She'd even asked Mrs. Chin to keep an eye on me and report any concerning behavior to Marcus or Harold. Miss Chin had been puzzled by Stephanie's concerns because she'd never observed anything unusual about my behavior. If anything, she'd noticed that I seemed more isolated than usual, less likely to chat over the fence or participate in neighborhood activity. She'd attributed this to normal life changes rather than mental health issues, but Stephanie's warnings had made her more conscious of my comings and goings. The realization that Stephanie had been setting the groundwork for questioning my competency was terrifying. If her plan had succeeded completely, I might have found myself not just divorced and financially devastated, but also facing challenges to my ability to make my own medical and financial decisions. The level of malice required to orchestrate such a comprehensive attack on another person's life was staggering. Armed with this new evidence, Rebecca and I developed a strategy that would expose the full scope of Harold and Stephanie's conspiracy while protecting me from further retaliation. We would file both criminal complaints and civil lawsuits, seeking not just financial compensation but also restraining orders that would prevent them from continuing their campaign of harassment. The goal was to make the cost of their betrayal so high that they'd never consider targeting me or anyone else in the same way again. But before we moved forward with legal action, I needed to have one final conversation with Marcus. Despite everything his wife had done and his complicity in his father's betrayal, he was still my son. I owed it to the relationship we'd once had to give him an opportunity to understand what had really been happening, and to choose whether he wanted to be part of the solution or continue enabling Stephanie's destructive behavior. I called Marcus and asked him to meet me for lunch at a restaurant where we'd celebrated his college graduation years early. I chose the location deliberately, hoping that the positive memories associated with the place might help him remember who he used to be before Stephanie's influence changed him. When he arrived, he looked nervous and defensive, like he was expecting a confrontation about his father's departure. Instead, I laid out everything I'd discovered about the conspiracy against me, showing him documented evidence of the financial fraud, the forged signatures, and the coordinated campaign to isolate me from family and friends. I explained how Stephanie had manipulated not just Harold but also Marcus himself, using his love for his father and his desire for family harmony to make him complicit in his mother's emotional and financial destruction. Marcus's reaction was everything I'd feared, and nothing I'd hoped for. Instead of shock or outrage at the scope of his wife's deception, he became defensive and accusatory. He suggested that I was exaggerating the evidence and misinterpreting innocent actions as malicious intent. He accused me of being unable to accept responsibility for my role in the family conflicts and of trying to blame everyone else for the failure of my marriage. Most painfully, Marcus told me that even if everything I was saying was true, he couldn't choose sides between his mother and his wife. He said that Stephanie was the mother of his future children and his partner for life, while I was someone he loved but would eventually have to learn to live without. His loyalty had to be with the family he was building rather than the family he'd come from, and he hoped I could understand and accept that reality. As I sat across from my son in that restaurant, watching him defend the woman who'd systematically destroyed his mother's life, I felt the final piece of my old self die. The mother who'd spent 31 years pouring her love and energy into raising this man was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love isn't always enough to overcome selfishness and moral cowardice. Marcus had made his choice and it wasn't me. I left that lunch knowing that my relationship with my son was over, not because of anything I'd done wrong, but because he'd chosen to prioritize his comfort over his integrity. Stephanie had succeeded in turning him against me so completely that he couldn't even see the evidence of her cruelty when it was laid out in front of him. He'd rather believe that his mother was crazy and vindictive than face the truth about the woman he'd married. But strangely, losing Marcus felt less devastating than I'd expected. The grief was real and sharp, but it was also clean in a way that the prolonged uncertainty of the past few years hadn't been. I knew exactly where I stood with my son now, and while that knowledge was painful, it was also liberating. I could stop trying to win back his love and start focusing on building a life that didn't depend on his approval or participation. The evening after my lunch with Marcus, I called Rebecca and told her to proceed with every legal remedy available to us. I wanted Harold prosecuted for fraud and identity theft. I wanted Stephanie held accountable for her role in the conspiracy. I wanted financial damages that would compensate me not just for the money they'd stolen, but for the years of psychological torture they'd inflicted. Most importantly, I wanted a public record of what they'd done so that anyone who might be tempted to trust them in the future would have access to the truth about their character. Rebecca was pleased with my decision but warned me again that the legal process would be long and emotionally challenging. Harold and Stephanie would fight back with everything they had, probably portraying me as an unstable ex-wife seeking revenge rather than just. They'd try to turn my pursuit of accountability into evidence of the mental health issues Stephanie had been suggesting I had all along, but I was ready for their retaliation because I finally understood something that had eluded me throughout their campaign against me. Their opinion of me didn't matter anymore. Harold's approval, Stephanie's acceptance, even Marcus's love, none of it was worth having if it required me to pretend that their treatment of me was acceptable. I'd spent years trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I was worthless, and I was done with that particular form of self-torture. The woman who'd been so devastated by being excluded from family dinners was gone, replaced by someone who understood that being excluded from a toxic system was actually a gift. The wife who'd begged for her husband's honesty was gone, replaced by someone who recognized that his honesty would have been worthless anyway. The mother who'd sacrificed her own well-being to maintain her relationship with her son was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love doesn't require you to enable someone else's moral failures. I was still Janice King, but I was a version of myself I'd never been allowed to be during my marriage. I was angry when anger was appropriate, rather than swallowing my feelings to keep peace. I was demanding when my rights were being violated, rather than accepting mistreatment to avoid conflict. I was prioritizing my own well-being over other people's comfort, and for the first time in decades, that felt not just appropriate, but necessary. As I prepared for the legal battle ahead, I found myself thinking about the woman I might have become if I'd recognized Harold and Stephanie's manipulation earlier. Would I have fought back sooner if I'd understood what was really happening? Would I have been able to save my marriage and my relationship with Marcus if I'd confronted the conspiracy before it was fully implemented? The questions were painful but ultimately irrelevant. I couldn't change the past, but I could determine how the story ended. The discovery phase was going to expose every detail of Harold and Stephanie's deception to public scrutiny. Their financial crimes, their psychological manipulation, their systematic campaign to destroy my reputation and relationships, all of it would become part of the court record. They'd wanted to write me out of my own life story, but instead they'd given me the opportunity to expose their true characters to anyone who cared to look. I'd started this journey as a victim of their conspiracy, confused and isolated and desperate for validation from people who'd already decided to betray me, but I was going to finish it as something much more powerful. A woman who'd refused to be erased, who'd fought back against impossible odds, and who'd emerged from their psychological warfare with her integrity intact, and her future entirely her own, to determine. The first criminal charges were filed on a Thursday morning in November. exactly 2 months after I'd overheard Harold discussing our divorce in Marcus's kitchen. Rebecca and I stood on the courthouse steps afterward watching reporters scribble notes about the fraud allegations, while I tried to process the fact that my husband of 4 decades was now officially a criminal defendant. The charges included identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes, with potential prison sentences that could put Harold behind bars well into his 70s. The media attention was immediate and intense, exactly what Harold and Stephanie had spent years trying to avoid. By evening, the local news was running stories about the respected businessman who'd allegedly robbed his wife blind while planning their divorce. Harold's company issued a statement placing him on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. His carefully cultivated reputation as a pillar of the community was crumbling in real time, and I felt no sympathy for his predicament. Stephanie's involvement in the conspiracy was harder to prove criminally, but Rebecca had found enough evidence to name her as a co-conspirator in the civil lawsuit we filed the following week. The charges against her included intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy to commit fraud, and something called tortious interference with familial relationship. While she might avoid criminal prosecution, the civil case could cost her hundreds of thousands of dollars and destroy her professional reputation in the business community where she'd built her career. Harold's response to the criminal charges was predictably self-serving and delusional. Through his attorney, he issued a statement claiming that the allegations were the vindictive fantasies of an unstable ex-wife who couldn't accept the end of their marriage. He portrayed himself as the victim of a woman scorned, suggesting that I'd fabricated evidence and manipulated witnesses to support false accusations. The irony of Harold claiming to be the victim of manipulation after orchestrating a 3-year campaign of psychological warfare against me was breathtaking. But Harold's legal team had underestimated the strength of Rebecca's case and the quality of evidence she'd assembled. The forensic accounting alone was devastating, showing clear patterns of unauthorized transfers and fraudulent transactions that no reasonable person could explain away. The forged signature on the mortgage documents was particularly damning because handwriting experts could definitively prove that Harold had committed identity theft to secure the loan without my knowledge. More damaging still were the witness statements Rebecca had collected from family members and friends, who could testify to the conspiracy's scope and timeline. Ellen's sworn affidavit detailed months of conversations with Stephanie about strategies for isolating me from family support systems. Tom's statement confirmed Harold's long-term planning and financial maneuvering. Even Mrs. Chen had provided a written account of Stephanie's attempts to raise concerns about my mental health and competency with neighbors and community members. The prosecution moved quickly once they reviewed Rebecca's evidence, recognizing that the case against Harold was virtually airtight. Within 2 weeks of the initial charges being filed, the district attorney's office offered Harold a plea bargain that would require him to admit guilt to the fraud charges in exchange for a reduced prison sentence and full financial restitution. His attorney advised him to accept the deal rather than risk a trial that could result in significantly harsher penalties. Harold's guilty plea hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in December, and I made the deliberate choice to attend. I wanted to look him in the eye when he admitted to the world that he'd robbed and betrayed the woman who'd loved him for over 4 decades. I wanted him to see my face when he acknowledged that everything I'd accused him of was true, and that his claims about my instability and vindictiveness had been lies designed to cover his own criminal behavior. The courtroom was nearly empty except for lawyers, court personnel, and a handful of reporters covering the case. Harold entered wearing an expensive suit that I'd probably paid for with money he'd stolen from our joint accounts, flanked by his legal team and looking like he'd aged a decade since our confrontation at Tom's house. When his eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen in them before: genuine fear mixed with what might have been shame. The judge read the charges methodically, asking Harold to confirm his understanding of each allegation and his decision to plead guilty rather than proceed to trial. Harold's voice was barely audible as he answered yes to each question, admitting to identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against his wife of 43 years. When the judge asked if he understood that his actions had constituted domestic violence in the form of economic abuse, Harold's composure finally cracked, and he began to cry. The sentencing phase revealed the full extent of Harold's criminal behavior and its impact on my life. Rebecca presented a victim impact statement that I'd written detailing not just the financial damage, but the psychological trauma of discovering that my husband had been systematically betraying me while pretending to love and support me. The judge listened intently as Rebecca read my words about feeling violated and terrorized in my own home by someone I'd trusted completely. Harold received 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and an order to pay full restitution plus punitive damages totaling nearly $400,000. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting Harold from contacting me directly or through third parties, acknowledging that his pattern of deception and manipulation posed an ongoing threat to my safety and well-being. As Harold was led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began, a sense of justice being served. But Harold's criminal conviction was only the beginning of the accountability process. The civil lawsuit against both Harold and Stephanie was proceeding on a parallel track, and their legal problems were mounting daily. Stephanie's employer had suspended her pending the outcome of the fraud investigation, and her professional licensing board had opened an ethics inquiry into her role in the conspiracy. The respectable suburban life she'd built was disintegrating as quickly as Harold's. Stephanie's deposition was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in January, and I insisted on being present to watch her try to explain away 3 years of calculated cruelty. She arrived at Rebecca's office with her own attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who specialized in defending white-collar criminals, looking composed and defiant despite the mounting evidence against her. If she felt any remorse for the devastation she'd caused, it wasn't visible in her carefully controlled expression. Under oath, Stephanie proved to be everything I'd expected: manipulative, self-serving, and utterly without conscience. She admitted to advising Harold about divorce strategies and financial planning, but claimed that her involvement had been motivated by concern for family harmony rather than malicious intent. She portrayed herself as a reluctant participant in Harold's decision-making process, suggesting that she'd simply been trying to help her father-in-law navigate a difficult situation as compassionately as possible. When Rebecca confronted Stephanie with evidence of her systematic campaign to isolate me from family and friends, she became defensive and argumentative. She insisted that her concerns about my behavior had been legitimate, that my resistance to Marcus's independence had been unhealthy and controlling. She claimed that her efforts to limit my involvement in family activities had been necessary to protect her marriage and her husband's emotional well-being from what she characterized as my toxic influence. The most revealing moment came when Rebecca asked Stephanie directly whether she'd encouraged Harold to pursue divorce as a way of removing me from Marcus's life entirely. Stephanie's carefully composed mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the cold calculation underneath. She admitted that she'd believed Harold and I were incompatible and that their separation would be better for everyone involved, including me. The idea that destroying my marriage had been an act of kindness was so delusional that even her attorney looked uncomfortable. But Stephanie's testimony also revealed information that made my blood run cold. She'd been documenting what she called my erratic behavior for over 2 years, keeping detailed notes about conversations and incidents that she'd interpreted as evidence of mental instability. She'd shared these observations with Harold, Marcus, and several other family members, building a case for questioning my competency that went far beyond what I'd previously understood. The notes Stephanie had kept were chilling in their detail and deliberate misrepresentation. She'd recorded my emotional reactions to her exclusionary behavior as evidence of paranoia and instability. She'd documented my attempts to maintain relationships with Harold and Marcus as examples of controlling and manipulative. She'd even noted occasions when I'd seemed confused or forgetful, suggesting that I might be experiencing early-stage dementia or other cognitive decline. Most disturbing was Stephanie's admission that she'd researched the legal process for having someone declared mentally incompetent, ostensibly to help a colleague who was dealing with an aging parent. But the timing of her research coincided perfectly with her escalating campaign against me, suggesting that she'd been preparing to challenge my ability to make my own financial and medical decisions if her other strategies failed to remove me from the family completely. The realization that Stephanie had been building a case for having me declared mentally incompetent was terrifying and enlightening in equal measure. If Harold's divorce plan had failed or if I'd proven more resilient than expected, she'd apparently been prepared to pursue legal guardianship as an alternative method of controlling my life and assets. The level of premeditation and malice required for such planning was staggering even by the standards of everything else she'd done. Rebecca's cross-examination of Stephanie lasted for 6 hours over 2 days, methodically exposing every lie and inconsistency in her testimony. By the end, Stephanie's attorney was advising her to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights rather than continue answering questions that were clearly establishing her liability for conspiracy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The deposition transcript would provide devastating evidence for trial assuming the case didn't settle first. Marcus's deposition was scheduled for the following week, and I dreaded it more than any other aspect of the legal proceeding. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my son, and I harbored a faint hope that confronting the evidence of his wife's deception might finally open his eyes to what she'd done to our family. But I also knew that forcing him to testify under oath about his role in the conspiracy would probably destroy whatever remained of our relationship permanently. Marcus arrived for his deposition looking haggard and defeated, like a man who'd finally begun to understand the true cost of his loyalty to Stephanie. When Rebecca asked him about his knowledge of his father's plans to divorce me, he admitted that he'd known for several months before Harold's intended announcement. He'd also known about the financial maneuvering and had even helped Harold move documents and personal items to Tom's house in preparation for the separation. But Marcus's most damaging testimony concerned his conversations with Stephanie about my behavior and mental state. Under oath, he acknowledged that his wife had repeatedly expressed concerns about my psychological stability and had suggested that my resistance to their marriage was indicative of deeper emotional problems. He'd allowed these concerns to influence his perception of my actions, interpreting normal maternal involvement as controlling and manipulative behavior. When Rebecca asked Marcus whether he'd ever witnessed any of the erratic or unstable behavior that Stephanie had documented in her notes, he was forced to admit that he hadn't. The incidents she'd described had either been private conversations between Stephanie and me, or they'd been misrepresentations of normal reactions to stressful situations. His wife had essentially convinced him that his mother was mentally ill based on secondhand reports and deliberately distorted interpretations of my behavior. The moment that broke my heart came when Rebecca asked Marcus whether he regretted his role in isolating me from the family and enabling Harold's financial crimes. Instead of expressing remorse or acknowledging the harm that had been done, Marcus became defensive and self-justifying. He insisted that he'd been caught in an impossible situation and had done his best to protect everyone involved. He seemed to genuinely believe that enabling my destruction had been an act of love rather than betrayal. Marcus's testimony made it clear that Stephanie's manipulation had been even more successful than I'd realized. She hadn't just turned him against me. She'd convinced him that betraying his mother was the morally correct choice. He'd internalized her narrative so completely that he couldn't see the evidence of her deception even when it was laid out in depositions and legal documents. The son I'd raised to value honesty and integrity had become someone who could participate in a conspiracy against his own mother and feel righteous about it. After Marcus's deposition ended, I sat in Rebecca's conference room for a long time, staring out the window at the city where I'd built my life and raised my family. The legal proceedings were going exactly as Rebecca had predicted. We had overwhelming evidence of Harold and Stephanie's conspiracy, clear documentation of their crimes, and witness testimony that would make their liability undeniable. We were going to win in court, probably decisive. But winning the legal battle felt hollow when weighed against the personal losses I'd sustained. My marriage was over, destroyed by a husband who'd proven capable of breathtaking cruelty and deception. My relationship with my son was irreparable, poisoned by a daughter-in-law whose malice was matched only by her skill at manipulation. My extended family and social network had been contaminated by years of lies and carefully crafted narratives designed to isolate me from support systems. The woman who'd discovered Harold's betrayal by overhearing a conversation at a family dinner had been naive enough to believe that truth and justice would somehow restore what had been taken from her. The woman sitting in that conference room knew better. Some things couldn't be repaired or recovered, no matter how complete the legal victory or how satisfying the punishment of the perpetrators. Some betrayals left wounds that never fully healed, and some relationships were broken beyond any possibility of repair. But there was something else growing alongside the grief and loss. Something that felt like strength rather than defeat. I was discovering that I could survive the destruction of everything I'd thought was permanent and sacred. I could function effectively in the aftermath of betrayal that would have destroyed the woman I used to be. I could fight back against people who'd underestimated my resilience and my determination to hold them accountable for their actions. The legal proceedings were moving toward their inevitable conclusion. Harold's criminal conviction was final, and his appeals had been rejected. Stephanie's employer had terminated her following the revelation of her role in the conspiracy, and her professional licenses were under review by multiple regulatory boards. The civil lawsuit was heading for trial unless they agreed to the substantial settlement Rebecca was demanding on my behalf. But the real victory wasn't going to happen in a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It was happening in the gradual reconstruction of my identity and my life around principles that I'd forgotten during the years when I'd defined myself primarily through my relationships with other people. I was remembering what it felt like to make decisions based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. I was rediscovering interests and passions that I'd set aside during decades of marriage and motherhood. The house that Harold and I had shared was being sold as part of the divorce settlement, and I was using my portion of the proceeds to buy a smaller place that would be entirely mine. I was choosing furniture and colors and artwork based solely on my own preferences, creating a space that reflected who I was rather than who I'd been expected to be. Every decision felt like an act of reclamation, a statement that Janice King still existed despite Harold and Stephanie's best efforts to erase her. The most surprising development was how little I missed the life I'd lost. The family dinners that had been sources of anxiety and exclusion, the social obligations that had required me to pretend everything was fine, the constant vigilance required to navigate Stephanie's manipulations and Harold's deceptions, none of it felt like a loss anymore. I was discovering that freedom from toxic relationships felt a lot like happiness, even when it came at the cost of being alone. The trial was scheduled to begin in March, 3 months after Harold's sentencing and 6 months after I'd first learned about the conspiracy against me. Rebecca was confident that we'd prevail decisively, possibly winning punitive damages that would bankrupt both Harold and Stephanie for years to come. But she also warned me that the trial would be emotionally challenging, requiring me to relive the trauma of their betrayal in front of a jury and the media. I told Rebecca that I was ready for whatever the trial might bring, because I'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to me, the discovery that the people I'd loved most were capable of systematic cruelty disguised as care. Everything else was just details to be worked through and obstacles to be overcome. The woman who'd been so devastated by exclusion from family gatherings had been replaced by someone who understood that some invitations weren't worth accepting, and some relationships weren't worth preserving. As winter turned to spring and the trial date approached, I found myself thinking less about the past, and more about the future I was building from the wreckage of my old life. I was planning to travel after the legal proceedings ended, to see places I'd always wanted to visit, but had never prioritized during the years when Harold's preferences took precedence over my own dreams. I was considering going back to school to finish the degree I'd abandoned when Marcus was born, pursuing interests that had been dormant for decades. Most importantly, I was learning to trust my own judgment again after years of being gaslit and manipulated by people who'd convinced me that my perceptions were unreliable. The woman who'd questioned her own sanity when Stephanie excluded her from family events had been replaced by someone who recognized manipulation tactics and refused to be their victim. I'd paid a terrible price for that education, but it was knowledge that would protect me for the rest of my life.
The trial would determine how much Harold and Stephanie would pay financially for their conspiracy against me, but the real judgment had already been rendered in my own heart and mind. They'd revealed their true characters through their actions, and I'd responded by becoming someone stronger and more authentic than I'd ever been during my marriage. They'd tried to write me out of my own story, but instead, they'd given me the opportunity to author a new chapter entirely on my own terms. The trial began on a crisp Monday morning in March, almost exactly 7 months after I'd discovered Harold's plan to announce our divorce at what I'd thought was going to be a reconciliation dinner. I arrived at the courthouse wearing a navy blue suit that I'd bought specifically for this moment, wanting to project confidence and competence, rather than the broken victim that Harold and Stephanie's attorneys would try to portray me as.
Rebecca walked beside me through the crowd of reporters and curious onlookers, her briefcase heavy with evidence that would expose every detail of the conspiracy that had destroyed my marriage and alienated me from my son. The jury selection process took 2 full days, with both legal teams carefully questioning potential jurors about their attitudes toward marriage, divorce, and financial crimes. Harold and Stephanie's attorneys were looking for people who might be sympathetic to their narrative about a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge through false accusations. Rebecca was seeking jurors who could understand the complexity of long-term psychological manipulation and the devastating impact of economic abuse on victims who'd trusted their abusers completely. When the trial proper began, Rebecca's opening statement was a masterpiece of clear, methodical storytelling. She laid out the timeline of Harold and Stephanie's conspiracy from its earliest beginnings through the elaborate financial crimes that had nearly left me destitute. She explained how Stephanie had systematically isolated me from family support systems while positioning herself as Harold's confidant and advisor. Most importantly, she helped the jury understand that this wasn't simply a case of a marriage ending badly, but a calculated campaign of psychological and financial abuse that had been planned and executed over years. Harold's attorney responded with exactly the defense Rebecca had predicted. I was an unstable woman who couldn't accept the natural evolution of family relationships, and my accusations were the fantasies of someone who'd rather blame others than take responsibility for the failure of her marriage. He painted Harold as a patient husband who'd endured years of controlling behavior before finally finding the courage to seek happiness elsewhere. Stephanie was portrayed as an innocent daughter-in-law who'd simply tried to help her father-in-law navigate a difficult situation with compassion and understanding. The prosecution of Harold's criminal case had already established the basic facts about his financial crimes, so the civil trial focused primarily on the scope of the conspiracy and the extent of damages I'd suffered. Rebecca called witness after witness to testify about Stephanie's manipulation tactics and Harold's deceptive behavior. Ellen's testimony about Stephanie's systematic campaign to turn Harold's family against me was particularly damaging, especially when she described specific conversations where Stephanie had coached family members on how to respond to my attempts to maintain relationships. Tom's testimony established Harold's long-term planning and the premeditation behind his financial crimes. He described conversations dating back over a year where Harold had discussed strategies for protecting assets and minimizing his financial obligations in a potential divorce. Most damning was Tom's account of Harold's relief at finally having Stephanie's support for leaving a marriage he described as a burden he'd carried for far too long. Ms. Jim's testimony provided crucial evidence about Stephanie's efforts to question my mental competency with neighbors and community members. Her detailed account of Stephanie's suggestions that I might be experiencing cognitive decline or emotional instability helped the jury understand conspiracy had extended far beyond financial crimes into a systematic attempt to undermine my reputation and credibility throughout my social network. The forensic accountant's testimony was devastating in its precision and scope. She'd traced every unauthorized transaction, every forged document, and every instance of financial deception that Harold had committed over the 8 months leading up to his planned divorce announcement. The total amount of money he'd stolen was staggering, but the pattern of small, frequent transfers showed a level of calculation and premeditation that made his crimes particularly egregious. But the most powerful moment of the trial came when Rebecca played recordings of phone conversations between Harold and Stephanie that had been captured during the criminal investigation. In one particularly damning exchange, Stephanie could be heard advising Harold on strategies for making me appear mentally unstable if I challenged the divorce proceeding. She suggested ways to document my emotional reactions to their manipulation as evidence of psychological instability, and she even discussed the possibility of pursuing guardianship proceedings if other methods of control proved insufficient. The recordings revealed the true nature of Harold and Stephanie's relationship and the extent of their collaboration in destroying my life. These weren't the conversations of innocent people trying to navigate a difficult family situation. These were the calculated discussions of conspirators planning the systematic destruction of someone they saw as an obstacle to their own happiness and security. Stephanie's attorney tried to damage my credibility by calling character witnesses who testified about incidents where I'd seemed emotional or confrontational during family gatherings. But Rebecca's cross-examination of these witnesses revealed that they were describing my normal reactions to deliberate provocation and exclusion. The so-called evidence of my instability was actually documentation of my healthy responses to psychological abuse. Marcus was called as a witness for the defense, and watching my son testify against me was one of the most painful experiences of my life. He described me as controlling and manipulative, unable to accept his independence or respect his wife's place in their marriage. He painted Stephanie as a patient woman who'd tried repeatedly to accommodate my unreasonable demands and include me in family activities despite my toxic behavior. But Rebecca's cross-examination of Marcus exposed the contradictions and coached nature of his testimony. When she asked him to provide specific examples of my controlling behavior, he could only cite incidents that had been filtered through Stephanie's interpretation. When she pressed him about whether he'd ever witnessed the mental instability that Stephanie had documented so carefully, he was forced to admit that his concerns about my psychological state were based entirely on his wife's reports rather than his own observation. The most devastating moment came when Rebecca asked Marcus whether he'd ever considered that his wife might have been manipulating his perceptions of his mother's behavior. His immediate angry denial revealed just how completely Stephanie had captured his loyalty and how thoroughly she'd convinced him that protecting her required betraying the son I'd raised to think critically and question authority, had become someone who accepted his wife's narrative without examination and defended it against overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Harold's testimony was a study in self-deception and narcissistic justification. He admitted to the financial crimes, but insisted that his motivations had been protective rather than malicious. He'd moved money and forged documents to ensure that I wouldn't be left completely destitute, he claimed, though he couldn't explain why protecting me had required stealing from me or why he'd never discussed these protective measures with me directly. When Rebecca confronted Harold with evidence of his conversations with Stephanie about strategies for questioning my mental competency, he became flustered and defensive. He insisted that those discussions had been theoretical, that he'd never seriously considered pursuing guardianship proceedings against me. But the recordings clearly showed him participating enthusiastically in planning that would have stripped me of my basic rights and autonomy if their other strategies had failed. Harold's attempt to portray himself as a reluctant participant in Stephanie's manipulation was undermined by the evidence of his active collaboration and the financial benefits he'd gained from their conspiracy. He'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from our joint accounts while claiming to be protecting my interests. He'd forged legal documents while insisting that he'd never intended to deceive. His testimony revealed him to be exactly what Rebecca had always said he was, a man who'd committed calculated crimes against his wife, and then tried to justify them as acts of love. Stephanie's testimony was the most chilling part of the entire trial. Even under oath and facing potential financial ruin, she remained largely unrepentant about her role in destroying my marriage and alienating me from my son. She admitted to advising Harold about divorce strategies and documenting what she characterized as my concerning behavior, but she framed all of her actions as necessary responses to what she saw as my toxic influence on her family. When Rebecca asked Stephanie directly whether she'd deliberately set out to isolate me from Harold and Marcus, she denied any malicious intent while simultaneously defending every exclusionary action she'd taken. She'd kept me away from family gatherings because my presence created conflict. She'd discouraged Harold and Marcus from confiding in me because I was judgmental and unsupportive. She'd researched strategies for questioning my mental competency because she'd been genuinely concerned about my psychological state. The most revealing moment came when Rebecca asked Stephanie whether she felt any remorse for the pain her actions had caused me. After a long pause, Stephanie responded that she regretted that I'd been hurt, but she didn't regret protecting her family from what she saw as my destructive influence. In her mind, destroying my marriage and alienating me from my son had been necessary acts of self-defense, rather than unprovoked attacks on an innocent woman. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict that exceeded even Rebecca's most optimistic prediction. They found Harold and Stephanie liable for conspiracy, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a range of other civil violations. The damages they awarded included full restitution for Harold's financial crimes, punitive damages that totaled over $2 million, and ongoing payments for therapy and other services I might need to recover from their psychological abuse. But more important than the financial award was the public vindication of everything I'd claimed about Harold and Stephanie's conspiracy. The jury had seen through their attempts at manipulation and self-justification, recognizing their actions for what they really were, a calculated campaign of abuse against someone who'd trusted them completely. The verdict was a clear statement that psychological manipulation and financial abuse wouldn't be tolerated, regardless of the family relationships involved. The media coverage of the trial and verdict was extensive, with several outlets describing the case as a cautionary tale about the hidden dynamics of family manipulation and economic abuse. Harold's criminal conviction and our civil trial had created a public record of their deception that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Anyone who might be tempted to trust them in the future would have access to detailed documentation of their willingness to destroy someone who'd loved them unconditionally. Harold's financial situation was catastrophic after the criminal restitution and civil damages were calculated. His pension and retirement accounts were seized to pay the judgment, and his wages would be garnished for years to come. The comfortable retirement he'd planned to finance with money stolen from our marriage was replaced by financial hardship that would probably last until his death. Stephanie's situation was equally dire, with her career destroyed and her own assets liquidated to pay her share of the damages. Marcus's reaction to the trial verdict was exactly what I'd expected: anger at me for pursuing legal action against his father and wife, rather than recognition that they'd brought their consequences on themselves through their own criminal behavior. He issued a public statement expressing support for Stephanie and Harold, describing them as victims of a legal system that had been manipulated by a vindictive woman seeking revenge rather than justice. Reading Marcus's statement was painful, but it was also liberating in a way I hadn't anticipated. His continued loyalty to people who'd been proven in court to be manipulative criminals demonstrated that our relationship was truly beyond repair. There would be no reconciliation, no moment of recognition where he acknowledged the truth about what his wife had done to our family. He'd chosen his side definitively, and it wasn't mine. But Marcus's rejection also freed me from the last remnant of hope that had kept me tethered to a family system that had become toxic beyond redemption. I could stop wondering whether he might eventually see through Stephanie's manipulation or whether Harold might ever express genuine remorse for his betrayal. The trial had provided definitive answers to those questions, and those answers allowed me to close the door on that chapter of my life completely. The house that Harold and I had shared sold quickly after the trial ended, with the proceeds split according to the divorce settlement that had been finalized during the criminal proceeding. I used my portion to buy a cottage near the coast, a place where I could watch the ocean change with the weather and the seasons, while I figured out who I wanted to be in this new phase of my life. Moving to the cottage felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit. Every piece of furniture I chose, every room I decorated, every decision I made about my living space was mine alone. For the first time in over 4 decades, I was creating a home that reflected my own preferences rather than compromising with someone else's vision. The result was a space that felt authentically mine, in a way that no place had since I'd left my childhood bedroom to marry Harold. The financial security provided by the trial judgment allowed me to make choices based on what I wanted to do rather than what I needed to do to survive. I enrolled in art classes I'd always been interested in,
but never had time for during the years when Harold's career and Marcus's needs took precedence over my own interests. I began volunteering with organizations that supported other victims of domestic violence and financial abuse, using my experience to help women who were struggling to recognize and escape their own toxic situation. Most surprisingly, I discovered that I enjoyed being alone in a way I'd never experienced during my marriage. The silence in my cottage wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. The freedom to make decisions without consultation or compromise wasn't selfish. It was liberating. The independence I'd feared during those early days after discovering Harold's betrayal had become the foundation of a life that felt more authentic and fulfilling than anything I'd experienced as a wife and mother. The therapy that had been recommended during the trial helped me understand the full scope of what Harold and Stephanie had done to me and why their manipulation had been so effective. I learned about gaslighting, triangulation, and other psychological abuse tactics that I'd experienced but hadn't had names for. More importantly, I learned to trust my own perceptions again after years of being told that my reactions to their behavior were unreasonable or exaggerated. Working with other survivors of similar abuse helped me put my own experience in context and recognize that Harold and Stephanie's behavior followed patterns that were depressingly common in cases of family manipulation and financial exploitation. I wasn't the only woman who'd been systematically isolated from her support systems by people who claimed to love her. I wasn't the only mother who'd been alienated from her children by daughters-in-law who saw her as competition rather than family. The support group I joined included women of all ages who'd been victimized by spouses, children, and in-laws who'd used psychological manipulation and financial control to dominate their lives. Hearing their stories helped me understand that my experience, while devastating, wasn't unique. The tactics Harold and Stephanie had used were standard operating procedures for people who saw family relationships as opportunities for exploitation rather than sources of genuine love and support. But the support group also showed me something hopeful. Women could recover from even the most comprehensive betrayal and build lives that were richer and more meaningful than what they'd lost. The survivors I met weren't bitter or defeated. They were strong and resilient and proud of what they'd overcome. They'd taken the worst things that had happened to them and transformed them into wisdom and strength that made them better equipped to navigate future relationships. 2 years after the trial ended, I received an unexpected phone call from Ellen, Harold's sister-in-law, informing me that Harold had suffered a heart attack and died in prison. She thought I should know, she said, though she wasn't sure whether I'd want to attend the funeral service. I thanked her for the information and told her I wouldn't be attending, but I didn't feel the satisfaction or closure I might have expected from news of Harold's death. Instead, I felt something closer to indifference. Harold had already been dead to me for years, ever since the moment I'd overheard him planning to destroy our marriage with the enthusiastic support of our daughter-in-law. His physical death was just the completion of a process that had begun the day he'd chosen Stephanie's approval over his wife's well-being. The man I'd mourned during our divorce proceedings had been the Harold I'd thought I'd married, not the criminal who'd died in a federal prison. Marcus didn't contact me about his father's death, confirming that our estrangement was complete and permanent. I learned from newspaper obituaries that Harold had been buried in a small ceremony attended by Tom's family and a few old friends, who apparently remained loyal despite his criminal conviction. Stephanie had attended the service, the obituary noted, still presenting herself as the devoted daughter-in-law who'd supported Harold through his legal difficulty. The fact that Stephanie had managed to maintain her position in Marcus's life even after her role in the conspiracy had been exposed in open court was initially frustrating but ultimately irrelevant. She could continue manipulating my son and controlling his perceptions of reality, but she could no longer affect my life in any meaningful way. The restraining orders that had been issued during the trial proceedings remained in effect, and any attempt to contact or harass me would result in additional criminal charges. 3 years after the trial, I received a wedding invitation that initially puzzled me. Marcus and Stephanie were renewing their vows, the invitation explained, in a ceremony celebrating their commitment to each other and their shared values. The invitation had been sent to my old address and forwarded by the postal service, suggesting that they either didn't know about my move to the cottage or didn't care enough to find my current address. I looked at the invitation for a long time, trying to decide what it represented. Was it a genuine attempt at reconciliation, an olive branch extended by people who'd finally recognized the damage they'd caused? Was it a deliberate provocation? A way of reminding me that they'd won the battle for Marcus's loyalty despite being exposed as manipulators and criminals? Or was it simply an oversight, an automatic inclusion on a mailing list that no one had bothered to update? In the end, the motivation didn't matter because my response was the same regardless. I threw the invitation in the trash without responding, just as I'd thrown away every other attempt at contact from Marcus over the past several years. The woman who'd once been desperate to maintain her relationship with her son at any cost was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some relationships weren't worth preserving if they required accepting abuse and betrayal. The cottage I'd bought with my settlement money had become more than just a place to live. It had become a symbol of the life I'd built from the ashes of Harold and Stephanie's destruction. Every room reflected choices I'd made without compromise or consultation. Every piece of art, every book, every plant in my garden was there because I'd wanted it there, not because someone else had approved of my decision. I'd also discovered talents and interests that had been dormant during the decades when my identity had been defined primarily through my relationships with other people. The art classes had led to a genuine passion for watercolor painting, and I'd begun selling my work at local galleries and craft fairs. The volunteer work had connected me with a community of strong, resilient women who valued authenticity over peacekeeping and honesty over harmony. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment and intuition in ways that would protect me from future manipulation. The gaslighting and psychological abuse that had made me question my own perceptions during the years of Harold and Stephanie's campaign against me would never work again. I knew what healthy relationships looked like, and I knew what behavior to reject immediately if anyone tried to recreate the toxic dynamics I'd escaped. The legal victory over Harold and Stephanie had provided financial security and public vindication, but the real triumph was personal and ongoing. Every day that I woke up in my cottage, made decisions based on my own preferences, and interacted with people who respected my boundaries, was a victory over the people who'd tried to erase me from my own life. They'd wanted to reduce me to a discarded wife, a rejected mother, a woman so thoroughly defeated that she'd disappear quietly rather than fighting back. Instead, I'd become someone stronger and more authentic than I'd ever been during my marriage. The woman who'd been so devastated by exclusion from family dinners had been replaced by someone who understood that being excluded from toxic systems was actually a gift. The wife who'd begged for her husband's honesty had become someone who recognized that some people's honesty wasn't worth having. The mother who'd sacrificed her own well-being to maintain her relationship with her son had evolved into someone who understood that real love sometimes required letting go. Standing on the deck of my cottage at sunset, watching the ocean stretch toward the horizon, I felt something I'd never experienced during the 43 years of my marriage to Harold. Complete peace with my own company. The woman who'd once defined herself entirely through her relationships with other people had discovered that she was interesting and valuable in her own right. The future spread out before me like the ocean, full of possibilities that were mine alone to explore. Harold and Stephanie had tried to write me out of my own story, but all they'd really done was give me the opportunity to start a new chapter where I was the author instead of just a supporting character in someone else's narrative. The ending they'd planned for me had become my beginning, and that was a victory more complete than any court judgment could ever provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.